The transmission landed on my desk at 14 minutes past the third rotation bell, and I almost deleted it without reading. That was the kind of carelessness that defined how we treated humans back then. Every message they sent us looked the same. Soft language, measured tone, words like request and concern and urge restraint. I had read 47 of these formal protests over the past 2 years, and not once had any of them contained a threat, a deadline, or even a raised voice. My name is Vorath Senis, and I serve as Senior Strategic Liaison for the Dravine Concordat. That title sounds important, and in most contexts it is. But when it came to the human file, my role had become little more than a joke among my colleagues. They called me the complaint reader, the soft letter specialist. Every time we hit a human colony, every time our raiders burned through their frontier settlements and stripped their mining outposts bare, the humans would send a letter. And I would read it, and I would file it, and then we would do it again. It had been going on for 2 standard years. Our fleets would cross into human-claimed territory, pick a colony that looked poorly defended, take what we wanted, and leave. The humans would protest. We would ignore the protest. The cycle continued without interruption, and at no point did anyone in the Concordat feel even slightly worried about it. High Marshal Torvan set the tone from the very beginning. After the first raid on a human agricultural settlement, the humans had transmitted a 4-page document expressing deep concern and requesting a formal meeting to discuss boundaries and mutual respect. Torvan read the first paragraph aloud in the War Council, paused, looked around the room, and said, "They want to talk about mutual respect. Perhaps we should send them a gift basket." The entire chamber had erupted in laughter. That laughter shaped our policy for 2 years. I should have seen it differently. I was trained to see it differently. My entire career had been built on reading the strategic signals behind diplomatic language, and yet I let myself be carried along by the mood of the room. Looking back, I think I was afraid of being the one who took the humans seriously when nobody else did. That kind of fear is how empires make their worst mistakes. The raids came in waves after that. Our fleet commanders would select a target based on 3 criteria: low military presence, high resource value, and distance from the human core systems. They treated the selection process like shopping. Each raid was planned with minimal effort, because minimal effort was all it required. We would arrive, overwhelm whatever token defenses existed, seize what we wanted, and depart before anyone could organize a meaningful response. The humans would send a letter. We would ignore it. The next raid would follow within a few weeks. By the time we hit our 9th colony, the letters had become so predictable that the intelligence staff had created a template matching game. They would bet on which phrases would appear in the next protest. Deep concern was always the favorite. Strongly urge was a close second. In the spirit of mutual cooperation, paid out at 3-to-1, because the humans used it less frequently. But when they did, the phrasing was always identical, word for word, as if they were copying from the same source document every time. Nobody thought to ask why a spacefaring civilization would use identical language across multiple diplomatic communications over a span of years. Nobody considered the possibility that the repetition was not a sign of unimaginative bureaucracy, but a sign of something else entirely. A checklist, a procedure, a series of required steps that had to be completed in sequence before the next phase could begin. The 48th transmission arrived on the morning after our raid on Branfield. Branfield was a human world in their outer agricultural belt, mostly farms and water processing stations. Nothing strategic, nothing valuable enough to fight over. That was the logic we used when we selected it. Our raiding fleet, a compact force of 12 warships under Commander Drevin Cal, had entered the system, disabled the orbital communication relays, and begun landing ground teams to seize grain reserves and water purification equipment. I watched the operation footage from my office on the Concordat homeworld, 9 relay jumps away. The feed was slightly delayed, but clear enough to follow in real time. What I saw should have alarmed me. Instead, I noted it, flagged it in my report, and moved on. That is perhaps the decision I regret most in my entire career. The humans on Branfield did not fight. That part was expected. What was not expected was the way they evacuated. Within 6 minutes of our fleet entering the system, the civilian population began moving toward designated rally points. not running, not panicking, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that only comes from rehearsal. Thousands of people flowing through streets and corridors like water through channels that had been carved long before anyone turned on the tap. By the time our ground teams touched down, the settlements were empty, every civilian accounted for, relocated to underground shelters that our scans had somehow missed during the initial survey. Our soldiers walked through abandoned buildings and found meals still warm on tables, toys still scattered on floors, screens still displaying half-finished work. The humans had left everything behind except themselves, and they had done it in under 10 minutes. I wrote in my report that the evacuation speed suggested prior planning. I noted that the shelter infrastructure indicated long-term preparation. I mentioned that the communication relays, which we believed we had disabled, might have transmitted an alert before going offline. I further observed that the pattern of evacuation routes suggested a drill that had been practiced many times, because the flow of movement showed none of the bottlenecks or hesitations that characterize improvised responses. Every corridor, every junction, every stairwell had been optimized for maximum throughput, as if someone had studied the physics of crowd movement and engineered the solution years in advance. My report was 16 pages long. It was read by 3 people, none of whom held any authority over fleet operations. Commander Drevin Cal filed his own report, which was 2 pages long, and concluded with the assessment that the humans had fled out of cowardice, and that their evacuation efficiency merely proved they had accepted their role as prey. His report was read by the High Marshal personally and distributed to every fleet commander in the Concordat. It was accompanied by a commendation for clean execution. 3 days after Brandfield, the humans sent their 48th letter. I opened it expecting the usual format: formal header, diplomatic greeting, itemized list of concerns, request for dialogue, respectful closing. I had read the pattern so many times I could have written it myself. This letter was different. It was 4 lines long, no formal header, no diplomatic greeting, no itemized concerns, no request for dialogue, just 4 lines of text transmitted on an open frequency, unencrypted, as if the humans wanted everyone in the sector to hear it. It read, "To the leadership of the Dravine Concordat, this is Earth's final warning. Stop attacking our people, or we will stop acting polite. There will be no further communication on this matter." I sat at my desk and read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time. Something in the phrasing made the air in my office feel different, like the temperature had dropped by a single degree. Not enough to shiver, just enough to notice. What struck me was not the content of the message but the absence of everything that had defined every previous communication. No case number, no reference to specific treaties or interstellar conventions, no carefully constructed legal language designed to establish a record for some future arbitration. They had stripped away every element of diplomatic formality and left behind nothing but the raw intent. That was not the behavior of a bureaucracy filing complaints for the record. That was the behavior of someone who had finished building their record and no longer needed to add to it. I ran a linguistic analysis on the transmission, comparing it to the 47 that preceded it. The vocabulary was different. The sentence structure was different. The previous messages had been written in a register that linguists call high diplomatic, the formal language used between governments who expect to maintain a relationship after the communication is complete. This message was written in a register that had no equivalent in Dravine culture. It was the language of a species that had made a decision and was informing you of the outcome, not asking for your input. I forwarded the transmission to the High Marshal's office with a priority flag and a note recommending we at minimum pause operations in human space until we could assess the shift in tone. The response came back within the hour. Torvon had read my note, read the human transmission, and sent back a single sentence. Schedule the Corvus Reach operation for immediate deployment. Full strike package. 3 fleets. He was not pausing. He was escalating. I requested a meeting with Counselor Mayeth, the only member of the senior council who had ever shown interest in my assessments. She received me in her chambers that evening, listened patiently as I laid out my concerns, and then asked me a question I could not answer. "Vorath," she said, "in 2 years of raiding, across 14 separate military operations targeting human settlements, How many humans have we killed? I pulled the number from memory. 11, I said. All accidental. Equipment malfunctions during evacuation, structural collapses, that sort of thing. No direct combat casualties. And how many of our personnel have the humans killed in those same operations? None, I said. Does that not strike you as unusual? It did. It struck me as deeply unusual. In 14 military operations against a spacefaring civilization, spanning 2 full years, we had never once encountered organized resistance. Not a single shot fired in our direction. Not a single trap laid. Not a single ambush attempted. The humans had absorbed every blow we delivered and responded with nothing but letters. Mayeth leaned forward in her chair. There are 2 possible explanations, she said. Either the humans are incapable of fighting back, or they are choosing not to. If it is the first, then the Corvus Reach operation will be a success. If it is the second, then we need to ask ourselves a very important question. What happens when they stop choosing? I left her chambers with a feeling I could not name at the time. It sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, and it stayed there through the night and into the next morning, when the first ships of the Corvus Reach strike force began assembling in formation above the homeworld. 3 full fleets, 96 warships, 20,000 combat personnel, the largest single military operation the Concordat had launched in over a decade, aimed at a human mining system on the edge of their territorial boundary. The stated objective was resource seizure. The real objective, and everyone knew it, was humiliation. Torvan wanted the humans to understand that their little warning had been received, considered, and dismissed with overwhelming force. I watched the fleet depart from the observation platform of the Strategic Liaison Building. The ships climbed into the dark sky in rows of 12, their engines painting blue-white trails against the stars, and I felt the stone in my chest grow heavier with each formation that passed overhead. Somewhere out in the black, in a direction I could not point to but somehow felt in my bones, the humans had stopped writing letters, and the silence that replaced them was louder than anything I had ever heard. I had spent 2 years reading 48 messages from a species I did not understand. Looking back, I realized the 48th was the only one that mattered. Not because of what it said, but because of what it promised would come next. Silence. And silence from humans, I was about to learn, was the most dangerous sound in the galaxy. They put me on the command ship because Torvan wanted a witness. That was the word he used when he summoned me to the briefing chamber 3 hours before the fleet jumped toward Corvus Reach. A witness. Someone from the diplomatic branch who could document the operation in detail and report back to the Council that the human problem had been solved decisively and permanently. I stood at the back of the command bridge, aboard the Concordat flagship Aethrin Voss, surrounded by tactical officers and fleet coordinators, who moved through their duties with the relaxed confidence of professionals who had never lost a battle. Commander Drevin Cal stood at the center console, watching the jump countdown with the expression of a man who had already written his victory report in his head. 3 fleets, he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone who enjoyed being watched. 96 warships against a mining outpost. The humans should feel honored we bothered to show up. The officers around him chuckled. I did not. The jump took 11 seconds. When the distortion cleared from the forward display and the Corvus Reach system materialized around us, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, because space is always silent, but the absence of activity. No human patrols, no defense platforms, no military vessels on any scanner sweep within the entire system. Just the mining stations themselves, orbiting a pale yellow star alongside a handful of cargo haulers and civilian transport craft. I ran my own scans from the secondary console, searching for the signatures I had come to associate with human presence in the systems we had raided before. Energy emissions from habitat modules, communication traffic between settlements, the constant low hum of civilian life that any occupied system produces. There was none. The system felt hollow, like a building with the lights on but no one home. The mining stations showed minimal power output, barely enough to keep their structural integrity fields active. The cargo haulers drifted in standard parking orbits with their engines cold. I thought about Brandfield, about the evacuations that moved too fast, about shelters that were too well prepared, about a pattern I had identified in my reports that no one had bothered to read. Drevin Cal studied the tactical display for approximately 4 seconds before issuing his assessment. Undefended, he said. Begin bombardment of orbital infrastructure. Landing teams prep for surface deployment. The fleet spread into attack formation, with practiced efficiency. The first warships moved into range of the orbital mining stations and powered their forward batteries. I watched the targeting solutions lock onto the stations one by one, green circles appearing on the display as each structure was acquired and assigned to a firing group. Then the weapons fired. Energy beams crossed the void and struck the mining stations in sequence, punching through hull plating and structural supports. Explosions blossomed across the orbital ring, silent flashes of white and orange that looked almost beautiful from a distance. It took less than 2 minutes to reduce the orbital infrastructure to wreckage, and that was when everything changed. The first anomaly appeared on the sensor operator's console. A young officer named Tellen Voss, no relation to the ship, suddenly sat upright in her chair and began tapping her display with increasing speed. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying a note of confusion that did not belong on a warship bridge during a combat operation. The stations were empty. Drevin Cal glanced at her. Of course they were empty. The miners evacuated. "No, sir. I mean completely empty. No atmosphere. No power readings prior to impact. No biological signatures at any point during our approach. These stations were shut down and depressurized before we arrived. Possibly days ago." A murmur passed through the bridge crew. I saw 2 officers exchange a glance that carried more information than a spoken sentence. The quick eye contact of people who have just realized the same thing at the same moment and do not want to be the first to say it aloud. That should have been the moment we stopped. That should have been the signal that made someone, anyone, say the words that needed to be said. They knew we were coming. They cleared the way. They let us fire on empty structures. No one said those words. Instead, Drevin Cal shrugged and ordered the landing teams to prepare for surface operations on the system's primary mining planet. He treated the empty stations as confirmation that the humans had fled, just like Branfield, just like every colony before it, cowards running from a superior force. I moved to a secondary console near the aft observation window and began reviewing the sensor data myself. What I found made the stone in my chest turn to ice. The stations had been evacuated cleanly, every piece of equipment removed or powered down, every data core wiped, every docking clamp released and stowed. This was not a panicked retreat. This was a controlled withdrawal executed with the precision of a surgical team clearing an operating theater before a procedure. The cargo haulers we had detected on arrival were positioned at exact intervals throughout the system, spaced with mathematical regularity, and when I checked their power signatures, I found they were running at minimal output, just enough to maintain life support for crews that scans showed were not aboard. They were decoys, props arranged to make the system look occupied when it was anything but. The humans had not fled from Corvus Reach. They had prepared it for us. I opened my mouth to alert the commander, and that was the moment the second anomaly hit. Every ship in the Concordat fleet registered a simultaneous sensor contact. Not an incoming vessel, not a weapon. A scan. Something was scanning us. All of us. Every ship, every system, every piece of hardware from the largest warship to the smallest shuttle, all tagged and cataloged in a single pulse that lasted less than 2 seconds. The bridge went quiet. Officers exchanged glances. Tellen Voss stared at her console with an expression I had never seen on a military professional before. It took me a moment to identify it. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who has just realized they are standing in a place they should not be. "Commander," she said, and her voice was steady but thin. That scan originated from at least 47 distinct points across the system. Some of them are inside our formation, between our ships. Drevin Cal turned to face her fully for the first time. "Between our ships?" "Yes, sir. Whatever scanned us, it was already here. It has been here the entire time. Cloaked, passive, watching." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Officers who had been leaning casually against their consoles stood upright. Hands that had been resting at sides moved to sidearms. The air on the bridge, which had been warm with confidence and mild boredom, turned cold. I pulled up the scan data on my console and began analyzing the signature. What I found made my hands stop moving. The scan had not just tagged our ships, it had mapped our internal systems, shield frequencies, weapon power conduits, engine harmonics, communication encryption keys. In less than 2 seconds, whatever was out there had acquired a complete technical blueprint of every vessel in our fleet. And then I understood. The empty stations, the absent defenses, the open, unprotected system that looked like an easy target. None of it was retreat. None of it was cowardice. The humans had cleared Corvus Reach the way a hunter clears the brush around a trap. They wanted an open field. They wanted us to fire first. They wanted that moment of aggression recorded and documented, because it meant something to them. Not for us. Not for any galactic court. For their own records. For their own rules. Every polite letter they had ever sent was a page in a file. Every unanswered protest was evidence logged. Every raid we launched without consequence was another line in a case they were building against us, not to present to some external authority, but to satisfy their own internal requirements for what they called escalation of force. The humans had not been enduring our attacks for 2 years because they could not respond. They had been enduring them because their own rules required a threshold to be crossed before they could respond, and we had just crossed it. We had fired on their infrastructure. We had launched the largest military operation in a decade against their territory. We had received their final warning and answered it with 96 warships. The file was complete. The threshold was met. The authorization was granted. A new contact appeared on the sensors. One ship, a single vessel at the far edge of the system, holding position just inside scanner range. It was small, barely larger than one of our courier ships, and its design was unlike anything in our military databases. No visible weapons, no heavy armor, no aggressive profile of any kind. It was a communications vessel, a messenger. It began broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, including several we did not know the humans could access. The message arrived in perfect Dravine, spoken with an accent so precise it sounded like it had been taught by someone who had spent years living among us. Attention, Dravine Concordat Forces. This is Earth Defense Coordination. Politeness phase concluded. Rules of engagement have been updated. You have 90 standard minutes to withdraw all vessels from this system. This countdown is not subject to negotiation, extension, or appeal. Your ships will not be targeted during the withdrawal window. At the conclusion of 90 standard minutes, any Concordat vessel remaining in this system will be considered a legitimate military target and will be engaged accordingly. The countdown begins now. The message ended. It did not repeat. Drevin Cal stood at the center of the bridge, with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set in the expression of a man who has just been insulted in front of his crew. I watched him process the message, watched the anger build behind his eyes, watched the moment he decided that retreat was not an option. One ship, he said. They sent one ship to threaten 3 fleets. He turned to his tactical officer. Target that vessel. Full battery. The tactical officer's hands moved to his console, and then stopped. Commander, our targeting systems are not responding to that contact. The vessel is not registering as a valid target in our acquisition software. Override it. I have attempted manual override 3 times, sir. The system accepts the command and then resets. They were already inside our systems. The realization hit the bridge crew like a cold wind. You could see it in the way their shoulders changed, the way their hands moved from confident to uncertain, the way their eyes started darting between consoles and colleagues, as if searching for solid ground in a room where the floor had just gone soft. Commander, I said, stepping forward before I could stop myself, I strongly recommend we withdraw. Every eye on the bridge turned to me. Drevin Cal's expression shifted from anger to contempt, with the smooth efficiency of a man who had practiced the transition many times. The diplomatic observer, he said, recommends we run from a single unarmed ship. Note that in the record. He turned back to the tactical display. All ships maintain position. Increase sensor sweeps. If anything else decloaks, I want to know about it immediately. We are not leaving this system because a courier told us to. Nobody argued. Nobody supported my recommendation. Not because they disagreed with me, but because disagreeing with Drevin Cal in front of his bridge crew was a career decision that none of them were prepared to make. I saw Tellen Voss look at me for a moment, and in that look, I read something that neither of us could say aloud. She had seen the same data I had seen. She understood what the empty stations meant. But understanding and speaking are different acts, and the distance between them is measured in rank and consequences. The countdown timer appeared on every display on the bridge. 90 minutes, 89 minutes and 50 seconds, 89 minutes and 40 seconds. The first 30 minutes were the worst. Not because anything happened, but because nothing did. The human courier ship remained at the edge of the system, motionless, transmitting nothing further. The 47 cloaked platforms remained undetectable. The void around our fleet was empty and quiet, and that emptiness pressed against the hull of every ship like a hand holding its breath. Officers tried to maintain routine. Sensor sweeps ran on cycle. Tactical projections were updated and re-updated with data that had not changed. Someone on the secondary bridge requested permission to send a drone to investigate the nearest platform coordinates, and Drevin Cal approved the request. The drone launched, flew to the designated position, scanned the area, and found nothing, absolutely nothing. Whatever had been there had either moved or was operating at a level of stealth that made our detection systems meaningless. At the 50-minute mark, I noticed something on the secondary sensor display that no one else had flagged. The background radiation levels in the system had shifted, not dramatically, not enough to trigger an alarm. But the pattern had changed in a way that was consistent with a large number of vessels holding position at extreme range, with their engines running at minimal output. I ran the numbers twice, checked my methodology 3 times, and arrived at a conclusion that made my stomach feel hollow. The 400 ships we would soon see were already here. They had been here before we arrived. They had been here before the countdown started. The 90-minute window was not time the humans needed to prepare. It was time they were giving us to leave. A courtesy. One final act of politeness before the politeness ended. I returned to my console and began composing a message to Counselor Macketh. I did not know if it would reach her in time, or if it would matter if it did. But I wanted someone in the Concordat to know what I knew. The humans had not sent a threat. They had sent a notification. There is a difference between those two things that most species learn only once, and usually too late. The timer counted down, the fleet held position, and somewhere in the black between our ships, 47 cloaked sensor platforms watched everything we did with the patient attention of a species that had already decided what came next. The timer reached 0 at the exact moment the third rotation bell would have sounded on the homeworld, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my mind reached for something so ordinary in a moment that was about to become anything but. Nothing happened for 10 seconds. I counted them, 10 full seconds of absolute stillness in which every officer on the bridge held their breath, and every sensor display showed the same empty void it had shown for the past 90 minutes. Drevin Cal stood at the center console with his arms folded, and I watched a small, satisfied smile begin to form at the corner of his mouth. He was about to speak. He was about to say something about bluffs, and empty threats, and the fundamental cowardice of a species that writes letters instead of fighting. He never got the chance. The first ship appeared directly ahead of us, less than 400 meters from the bow of the Athrin Voss. It did not decloak. It did not emerge from a jump point. It was simply not there. And then, it was there, as if someone had reached into the fabric of space and placed it like a piece on a game board. The bridge crew reacted with a collective flinch, bodies jerking backward, hands reaching for consoles that suddenly seemed inadequate for the situation. The second ship appeared off our port side. The third appeared above us. The fourth and fifth materialized in the gap between the Athrin Voss and the next warship in our formation. They kept coming, ship after ship after ship, folding into the system from transition points that our navigational charts said did not exist, occupying positions that our tactical doctrine said were impossible, arriving with a synchronization so precise that the entire deployment looked less like a military operation and more like the universe rearranging itself. I stopped counting at 200, not because there were only 200, but because my mind refused to process numbers beyond that point. The tactical display, which had been showing our 96 warships spread across the system in a confident attack formation, was now so dense with new contacts that individual ships were no longer distinguishable. The screen was a solid field of blue markers surrounding a thin cluster of red ones. We were the red ones. But it was not the number that made my hands go numb. It was the silence. In every combat engagement I had ever studied, in every military operation across every species the Concordat had encountered, there was noise. Challenges broadcast on open channels, war cries, demands for surrender, threats, posturing, the psychological dimension of warfare that every civilization in the galaxy considered essential. The humans made no sound at all. No broadcasts, no demands, no identification signals. Nothing but the steady hum of engines and the soft pulse of sensor contacts multiplying on our screens. 200 ships. 300. More arriving every second, and not a single word spoken. Drevin Cal's smile had disappeared. In its place was something I had never seen on his face before. A kind of blankness that comes when the brain encounters a situation so far outside its experience that it simply stops generating expressions. He stared at the tactical display and said nothing. "Commander," Tellen Voss said from her station, and her voice had the careful flatness of someone delivering news they wish they did not have. "I am reading over 400 distinct vessel signatures. Fleet composition includes heavy carriers, fast attack cruisers, electronic warfare platforms, and at least 12 ship classes I cannot identify. Their formation is not standard, it is adaptive. They are not holding fixed positions. They are moving in coordinated patterns around our fleet, adjusting in real time to our shield coverage and weapon arcs." She paused, swallowed, and continued. "They have us surrounded in 3 dimensions. Every escape vector is covered. Every jump point in the system is blocked. And Commander, their ships are not powering weapons." That last detail was the one that landed hardest. 400 warships surrounding our fleet, and not a single weapon powered. They were not preparing to fight. They were waiting to see if they needed to. Drevin Cal found his voice. "All ships, defensive formation, power shields to maximum, charge all forward batteries." The order went out across the fleet. 96 Concordat warships began reconfiguring into a defensive sphere, shields flaring to full output, weapon systems cycling to combat readiness. The response was fast, professional, and completely meaningless. I knew it. Tellen Voss knew it. Half the bridge crew knew it. But the alternative to action was paralysis. And Drevin Cal was not a man who could stand still. The humans responded to our defensive posture with a single, coordinated action that demonstrated more about their capabilities than any weapon could have. Every ship in their fleet, all 400 and growing, adjusted its position simultaneously. Not sequentially, not in waves, but all at once. Every vessel shifting by exactly the same distance, in exactly the same direction, at exactly the same moment, like a flock of birds responding to a signal that no outside observer could detect. The adjustment moved their formation precisely 600 meters closer to ours. Close enough to make a statement, far enough to remain outside immediate weapon range. The message was unmistakable. "We see your shields. We see your weapons. We are not impressed." Then the engagement began. I need to be precise about what happened next, because precision matters. The Concordat lost the Battle of Corvus Reach in 11 minutes. I say lost, but that word implies a contest. And what took place was not a contest. It was a demonstration. The first thing that failed was our communications. Not jammed, not disrupted, redirected. Every signal our ships transmitted was caught, decoded, and rerouted through human relay systems, so smoothly that our officers did not realize for the first 2 minutes that they were talking to no one. Orders went out and vanished. Status reports were transmitted and absorbed. The fleet was still functional, but it was deaf and mute, each ship isolated from the others despite every antenna working perfectly. The second thing that failed was our shields. This was the part that broke something inside the confidence of every engineer and weapons specialist on the bridge. Our shields did not collapse from external force. They collapsed from the inside. The humans broadcast a frequency, a specific, precisely calibrated harmonic pulse that resonated with our shield generators at their molecular level. The shields did not overload. They did not shatter. They simply switched off. Like someone had reached inside each ship and pressed a button. Across the entire fleet, 96 sets of shields went dark within the same 4-second window. That frequency should not have existed. Our shield technology was classified at the highest level. The harmonic profile of our generators was a state secret, known only to senior engineers and the military council. The humans had it. They had it precisely, down to the subatomic oscillation patterns of the crystal matrices inside each generator. That meant they had scanned our ships at a depth we did not believe was possible, and they had done it so quietly that we never detected the intrusion. The third thing that failed was our weapons. With shields down and communications severed, Dreven Cal ordered a blind firing solution, every ship targeting the nearest human vessel and firing independently. The order was brave and utterly futile. Our weapon systems activated, charged, locked onto targets, and then shut down. The targeting computers displayed a message none of our technicians had ever seen before. A simple line of text in Dravine that read, "System disabled by external override. Contact your system administrator." Someone on the bridge let out a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a laugh. It was the kind of sound people make when reality becomes so absurd that the brain cannot decide between panic and amusement. The most powerful military fleet in the Concordat's history, disabled by a message that read like a technical support notification. The humans had not merely scanned our weapons, they had accessed them. They were inside our systems, had been inside our systems since the moment we entered the Corvus Reach system, possibly before. The 47 cloaked sensor platforms that had tagged us on arrival were not just scanners, they were intrusion points. Digital doorways that had been feeding human software into our ships for the past 90 minutes, while we sat and watched a countdown timer and convinced ourselves we were in control. With no shields, no weapons, and no communications, 96 Concordat warships hung in space like decorations. The human fleet did not fire a single shot. Instead, they docked. The human ships moved into position alongside our vessels with the gentle precision of medical instruments. Docking tubes extended. Airlocks cycled. Breaching teams entered our ships through access points that should have been sealed but somehow were not, because the same software that disabled our weapons had also unlocked our doors. Reports began filtering in from across the fleet, fragmented communications from ships close enough to signal each other through hull contact rather than broadcast. The same thing was happening on every vessel. Airlocks opening, footsteps in corridors, human teams moving through Concordat warships with the calm certainty of people walking through their own homes. I stood on the bridge of the Aethrin Voss and watched the forward airlock indicator change from sealed to open. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the bridge. Not running, walking. The steady, measured pace of people who had done this before, and felt no need to rush. The bridge door opened, and they came in. 6 human soldiers in matte black armor that covered them from neck to boot. No insignia, no unit markings, no decoration of any kind. They carried weapons, compact sidearm units holstered at their thighs, but not one of them drew. They moved through the bridge with practiced efficiency, each soldier taking a position at a key console, while the others secured the officers standing nearby. They did not shout, they did not threaten. They moved with a quiet professionalism that was more unsettling than any display of aggression could have been. Each Concordat officer was approached individually, disarmed with gentle but irresistible firmness, and guided to a seated position against the aft wall. Restraints were applied to wrists, lightweight polymer bands that looked fragile but resisted every pull and twist. I watched this happen to 17 bridge officers in less than 3 minutes. Not one human raised their voice. Not one Concordat officer was struck, pushed, or handled with anything more than the minimum force required to secure compliance. It was efficient. It was professional. It was terrifying, in a way that raw aggression could never be, because aggression comes from emotion, and emotion has limits. This came from training. Training has no limits, except the ones the trained person chooses to impose. The last person to be restrained was Dreven Cal. He stood at the center console with his back straight and his expression locked in the rigid dignity of a commander who has lost everything except his posture. 2 human soldiers approached him from either side. He looked at them, looked at their weapons, looked at the restraints in their hands, and then sat down on the deck without being asked. They secured his wrists with the same careful precision they had used on everyone else. Then the officer entered. She was shorter than I expected. Compact build, dark hair pulled back from a face that carried the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty. She wore the same matte black armor as her soldiers but carried no visible weapon. She surveyed the bridge with eyes that moved like targeting sensors, quick, methodical, missing nothing, and then she spoke. Her Dravine was flawless, not merely competent, not merely understandable, but flawless, with the accent and inflection of someone who had spent years studying our language, the way a surgeon studies anatomy. I am Captain Lena Whitford of the Earth Defense Coordination. Your crew is unharmed. All 96 vessels in your fleet have been secured. No Concordat personnel have been injured during this operation, and none will be injured going forward. She paused, letting that sink in. No casualties. Across 96 ships, in 11 minutes. Your ships will be returned to the Concordat once we have completed a full copy of your navigational and military databases. We already had most of the relevant information, but we prefer to be thorough. Drevin Cal looked up at her from the deck. You cannot do this, he said. And even now, even in restraints, even with his entire fleet disabled around him, his voice carried the tone of a man issuing an order. Whitford looked at him with an expression that was not contempt, not pity, but something closer to patience. The look a teacher gives a student who has answered incorrectly, but might still learn. We just did, she said. I found my voice. It took effort, because my throat had gone dry, and my hands were trembling against the polymer restraints. But I managed to push the words out. Captain Whitford, I have a question. She turned to face me. You are Vorath Senis, Senior Strategic Liaison. She knew my name. She knew my title. She had known who was on this ship before she boarded it. Yes, I said. Why did you not do this sooner? You clearly had the capability. You have had it for some time. Why did you let us raid your colonies for 2 years? The captain was quiet for a moment. Something shifted behind her eyes, something that looked very much like sadness, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. Because we were hoping you would stop on your own. We always hope for that. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned and began issuing instructions to her team. Data extraction from the navigational core, security assessment of the engine room, medical checks on all restrained personnel, food and water distributed to every secured compartment on every captured ship. Food and water. They had brought rations, not as an afterthought, as part of the operation plan. They had planned the capture of 96 warships and 20,000 military personnel, and they had included meal distribution in the tactical briefing. A medic entered the bridge shortly after Whitford finished her instructions. He carried a compact medical kit and moved from officer to officer, scanning each one with a handheld device, checking vital signs, asking in careful Dravine if anyone was experiencing pain or distress. When he reached an engineering officer named Haleth, who had a pre-existing respiratory condition that made her breathing labored under stress, he adjusted something on his scanner, consulted a readout, and produced a small inhaler device calibrated for Dravine lung chemistry. He had that device ready. He had brought it with him. Someone in the human chain of command had reviewed the medical records of every crew member aboard every ship in our fleet, and had packed species-appropriate medications for conditions they had no business knowing about. I watched Haleth take the inhaler and breathe deeply, and I saw the confusion on her face give way to something she could not name. It was the same thing I was feeling, the disorientation of being treated with care by someone you had been told was your enemy. I was escorted from the bridge by 2 soldiers who guided me by the elbows with the same firm gentleness I had seen applied to every other officer. They walked me down 3 corridors and into a holding bay on the port side of the ship, a cargo area that had been cleared and fitted with temporary seating and lighting. As we passed a viewport on the way, I stopped. The soldiers allowed it. Perhaps they wanted me to see. The human fleet filled the viewport from edge to edge. Ships of every size and configuration, arranged in formations that shifted and flowed like living things, their hulls reflecting the pale light of the Corvus Reach star. It was the largest military force I had ever seen assembled in one place, and I had spent my career studying fleet deployments. But that was not what made me stop. What made me stop was the movement. As I watched, ships at the outer edges of the formation were powering down, engine signatures dimming, running lights going dark, not retreating, parking, switching off. The battle, such as it was, had required only a fraction of what they brought, and now the surplus was settling into standby, with the casual efficiency of workers clocking out at the end of a shift. They had brought everything, and used almost nothing. The force that dismantled 3 Concordat fleets in 11 minutes was not the full extent of their capability. It was the amount they considered appropriate. The rest was there in case they had underestimated us. They had not underestimated us. I stood at the viewport for a long time, watching human warships go dark one by one, and I felt the stone in my chest dissolve and reform into something new. Not fear, exactly. Fear is what you feel when you face danger. This was something deeper. This was the feeling of realizing that every assumption you have ever held about the universe was wrong, and that the species you dismissed as soft and cowardly had been the most dangerous thing in the galaxy the entire time, standing right behind you, tapping you on the shoulder, waiting politely for you to turn around. The room they put me in had a window. That was the first thing I noticed, and it told me more about the humans than any intelligence briefing ever had. They had taken me from the holding bay on the Aethrin Voss, transported me by shuttle to a human station at the boundary of Concordat space, and placed me in a room that had a bed, a desk, a chair, lighting calibrated to Dravine visual preferences, and a wide window that looked out onto open space. Not a cell, a room, with a view. The bed was the right length for my body. The ambient temperature was set 2 degrees higher than the human standard, which is the range where Dravine physiology feels most comfortable. The desk held a data tablet loaded with reading material in my own language. On a small shelf beside the bed, there were 3 containers of food, each one labeled in Dravine, with the contents and nutritional composition, each one prepared according to dietary guidelines that humans should not have known existed because we had never published them outside our own medical archives. They had studied us, not our weapons, not our fleet movements, not our military capabilities. Us, our biology, our comfort, our diet, the precise temperature at which our skin stops producing stress hormones and starts producing the compounds associated with safety and calm. They had prepared this room specifically for a Dravine occupant, and they had done it with a level of care that communicated something I was only beginning to understand. The humans did not see us as enemies. They saw us as a problem to be solved, and they solved problems by understanding them completely. I slept for 6 hours. When I woke, there was a fresh container of food on the desk that had not been there before, and a message on the data tablet informing me that a transition liaison would visit me at the 4th hour. The message was written in formal Dravine, with perfect grammar, and the kind of courteous phrasing that our own diplomatic corps would have approved. The transition liaison arrived exactly on time. She was a human woman of average height, with brown skin and dark eyes that carried an expression I could not immediately categorize. It was not hostile. It was not friendly in the performative way that diplomats often are. It was something quieter, attentive, the look of someone who is genuinely paying attention. "I am Grace Holloway," she said, in Dravine that was less perfect than Captain Whitford's, but still remarkably fluent. "I have been assigned as your point of contact for the transition process. May I sit?" She gestured to the chair across from the desk. I nodded, and she sat down and placed a small data device between us. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to tell you that every member of your fleet is safe. All 20,000 personnel have been housed in quarters similar to this one. Medical teams have completed assessments, and 12 individuals who required treatment for pre-existing conditions have received care. No one has been harmed, and no one will be harmed." She said this the way a doctor delivers good test results, calmly, factually, without emphasis, because emphasis would suggest that the alternative had been a possibility, and she wanted me to understand that it had never been one. "I have some questions," I said. "I know," she said. "But first, I would like to show you something." She activated the data device. A projection appeared above the desk, displaying a document I recognized immediately. It was a case file, organized in chronological order, beginning with the date of the first Concordat raid on human territory 2 years ago, and ending with the battle at Corvus Reach. Every raid was documented. Every one of the 14 military operations we had conducted in human space was listed with dates, fleet compositions, target descriptions, and outcomes. Beside each entry was a casualty report, and the numbers matched my own records exactly. 11 human civilians dead across all operations, property damage calculated to the nearest standard credit unit, resource losses itemized by type, quantity, and replacement cost. This is the record we have been maintaining since your first incursion into our territory, Grace Holloway said. Every attack, every loss, every communication we sent requesting that you stop. This file was presented to our governing council after your most recent operation at Branfield, and it formed the basis for the decision to escalate our response. I studied the file in silence. The level of detail was extraordinary. They had recorded atmospheric conditions during ground operations. They had logged the exact timestamps at which our ships entered and exited their systems. They had documented the specific agricultural equipment we had seized from Branfield, down to the serial numbers on individual water filtration units. You documented everything, I said. We document everything, she confirmed. It is how we govern ourselves. No military action is authorized without a complete evidentiary record justifying the use of force. Our officers cannot engage a foreign power without demonstrating that every reasonable alternative has been attempted and exhausted. She switched to the second file. This one was different. This was not a record of what we had done to them. This was a record of what they had said to each other about what we had done to them. I was reading the internal communications of the human government, meeting transcripts, committee votes, military assessments, civilian petitions, 2 years of debate, discussion, and deliberation conducted by a civilization deciding whether or not to go to war. The first document was a transcript of a defense committee meeting held 3 days after our initial raid. The committee had reviewed the attack, assessed the damage, and voted on a response. The vote was 11-2 against military retaliation. The majority opinion cited insufficient justification for force and recommended continued diplomatic engagement. 11-2, after we had already raided one of their colonies. The next document was a petition signed by 4,000 civilians living on the colony we had attacked. Not a demand for vengeance, a request. A request that their government exhaust every possible avenue of communication before considering a military response. 4,000 people whose homes we had just ransacked, asking their leaders to give us another chance. I scrolled through the file, meeting after meeting, vote after vote. Each time, the same pattern. Our raids escalated, our behavior worsened, and the humans debated. They argued, they disagreed with each other. Military commanders recommended action, and were overruled by civilian oversight committees. Intelligence analysts presented evidence of our capabilities and our intentions, and ethics boards reviewed the evidence and asked whether the threshold for force had truly been met. 12 times, the committees voted against retaliation. 12 times, they chose to send another letter instead. 12 times, they looked at what we were doing to their people and decided that the right response was patience. Not because they were weak, not because they lacked options, because every time the vote came up, someone in the room stood and made the argument that violence should be the last resort, not the first, and that a civilization is defined not by what it can do, but by what it chooses not to do. I read transcripts of those arguments. I read the words of officers and legislators and ordinary citizens who stood in chambers and conference rooms and said things like, "If we respond to every provocation with force, we become what they think we are," and "The strength of our position is that we have not yet used our strength. And every day we choose not to fight is a day we prove that fighting is not who we are." The 13th vote was different. It came after Branfield, after our 48th and final letter was transmitted. The committee reconvened, and for the first time in 2 years, the room was quiet before the discussion began. No arguments, no impassioned speeches. The chairperson read the Concordat's final warning response, the deployment order for 3 full fleets aimed at Corvus Reach, and asked the committee whether continued diplomatic engagement remained a viable strategy. The vote was unanimous, 13-0. Authorization for defensive military response, with strict constraints on the use of force. No lethal engagement unless fired upon with lethal intent. Disable, detain, and return. Minimum force doctrine at every stage. Even in the moment they finally decided to act, they imposed rules on themselves that limited what they could do. They built a cage around their own power and locked the door from the inside. I set the data device down on the desk. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. From something I did not have a word for in my language. The closest approximation would be the feeling you get when you realize you have been staring at a painting upside down, and someone has just turned it right side up, and suddenly every shape and color means something entirely different. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Grace Holloway folded her hands on the desk. "Because I want you to understand what the Concordat was fighting against. Not our ships, not our weapons, not our technology. You were fighting against the collective will of 8 billion people who spent 2 years choosing, over and over, not to do what they were fully capable of doing. That restraint was not weakness. It was the hardest thing we did." She let the silence hold for a moment before continuing. "The terms of resolution are as follows. Full withdrawal of all Concordat military and commercial assets from human claim territory. Reparations calculated to the exact value of resources seized and property damaged during the 2-year incursion period, and the establishment of a permanent diplomatic channel between our governments." "That is all?" I said, and I heard the surprise in my own voice. "That is all. No occupation of Concordat systems? No military oversight? No punishment beyond restitution?" "No." "Why not?" She looked at me with those attentive eyes, and I saw something in them that I recognized from the transcripts I had just read. It was the same quality that ran through every committee vote, every civilian petition, every officer who had argued for patience in the face of provocation. It was not mercy exactly. Mercy implies power over someone who deserves harm. This was something else. This was a decision made by people who had every right to take more, and chose to take only what was theirs. "Because occupation would require us to become something we are not," she said, "and we have spent a very long time deciding what we are." She pulled up one final display, a navigational chart of the space surrounding Concordat territory. My territory, my home, and scattered across that chart, in positions that formed a complete sphere around every major Concordat system, were blue markers. Human fleet positions. Hundreds of them. They were already there. Already in position. Not attacking, not blockading, not disrupting trade or communications or civilian traffic. Just present. Sitting in the dark between the stars, running silent, waiting. "These deployments are defensive in nature," Grace Holloway said. "They will remain in place until the terms are accepted and verified. No Concordat vessel will be intercepted, no system will be blockaded, and no civilian activity will be disrupted. The fleets are there to ensure that the transition proceeds smoothly and that no faction within the Concordat attempts to resume hostilities." I stared at the chart. The blue markers were everywhere. Around our homeworld, around our shipyards, around our fuel depots and agricultural stations and communication hubs. They had mapped our entire civilization and positioned themselves to control every strategic point without firing a shot or disrupting a single civilian life. "You are not threatening war," I said slowly. "No," she agreed. "You have already won the war." "Yes. And you are offering us the opportunity to accept terms that are fair, reasonable, and proportionate, so that neither side has to acknowledge that a war took place at all." Grace Holloway smiled. It was a small smile, tired and genuine. "We find that outcomes are better when everyone gets to keep their dignity. People make terrible decisions when they feel humiliated. We would rather the Concordat accept these terms because they are fair than reject them because they feel degrading." I sat in that room with a window and a bed, the right length for my body and food prepared according to dietary standards that no human should have known, and I understood something fundamental about the species that had captured me. They were not generous because they were naive. They were not merciful because they were soft. They were generous and merciful because they could afford to be. Because when you possess the kind of power that surrounds an entire civilization overnight without anyone noticing, the only thing left to prove is that you will not abuse it. I asked Grace Holloway one more question before she left. What happens if the Concordat refuses your terms? She stood, gathered her data device, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at me. Then we wait, she said. We are very good at waiting. The door closed behind her. I sat at the desk for a long time, looking at the navigational chart she had left on the display. Blue markers around every system I had ever called home. I thought about Torvan, reading the first human letter, and making his joke about gift baskets. I thought about the intelligence staff running their betting pool on which phrases would appear in the next protest. I thought about Dreven Kahl filing his 2-page reports that dismissed an entire species as cowards. And I thought about 47 letters that were not complaints at all, but pages in a legal brief, steps in a procedure, evidence compiled by a civilization that would not allow itself to act until the case for action was complete. We had mistaken their patience for passivity. We had mistaken their process for paralysis. And now, sitting in a room designed for my comfort by people I had never met, surrounded by the evidence of a preparation so thorough that it accounted for the respiratory condition of a single engineering officer aboard one of 96 captured ships, I understood that the Concordat had never been the predator in this relationship. We had been the subject of a study conducted by a species that learned everything about us before deciding what to do with what they learned. Then I began composing my report to the High Council. It was the most important document I would ever write, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the future of the Dravine Concordat depended on whether anyone would listen. The High Council chamber was the largest enclosed space on the Concordat homeworld, a domed hall of polished stone and reinforced crystal, designed to make everyone who entered feel small. I had been inside it only twice in my career, both times as a junior observer, seated so far from the council table that the voices of the speakers reached me as echoes rather than words. This time I stood at the center, the speaking floor, the spot where the stone was worn smooth by centuries of feet belonging to generals, ambassadors, and heads of state who had delivered the words that shaped the Concordat's history. The council members sat in their elevated positions around me, arranged in the traditional semicircle, and behind them, filling the gallery rows all the way to the distant walls, sat every senior military officer, every regional governor, and every diplomatic advisor the Concordat employed. High Marshal Torvan sat at the center of the council arc. Councillor Mayeth sat 3 seats to his left. Between and around them sat the 11 other members of the governing body, and every single one of them was looking at me with an expression I had learned to read during my decades in diplomatic service. They were afraid, and they were angry, and they did not know which emotion to follow, so they were looking to me, the complaint reader, the soft letter specialist, to tell them what to do. The irony was not lost on me. Honored council members, I began, and my voice carried clearly through the chamber's acoustic design, reaching every ear without amplification. You have received my preliminary report on the events at Corvus Reach. You have reviewed the tactical data. You have seen the fleet footage. I stand before you now to deliver my strategic assessment and my recommendation. I paused. Not for dramatic effect, for breath, because what I was about to say would change the shape of our civilization, and I wanted to be certain of every word. The Dravine Concordat cannot win a military engagement against humanity. This is not an opinion. This is not a preliminary assessment subject to revision. This is a fact established by direct observation and confirmed by every piece of intelligence we have gathered over the past 2 years. The chamber reacted. Murmurs from the gallery, shifting postures among the council members. Torvan's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. He had spent 3 days watching the footage from Corvus Reach, and even his considerable capacity for denial had limits. At Corvus Reach, a human force of approximately 400 vessels engaged and neutralized 3 full Concordat fleets, totaling 96 warships and 20,000 personnel, in 11 minutes. They accomplished this without firing a single weapon. They disabled our shields by broadcasting a frequency that exploited harmonic vulnerabilities in our generator crystals. vulnerabilities that are classified at the highest level of our military secrecy. They accessed our weapon systems through digital intrusion methods we did not detect and cannot replicate. They severed our communications by redirecting our own signals through relay networks we did not know existed. I let those facts settle into the room before continuing. They then boarded every ship in our fleet simultaneously, secured all personnel without injury, and provided food, water, and medical attention to every individual in custody. The operation was planned and executed with a level of precision that exceeds anything in our military history, and I want the Council to understand something critical about that operation. It was not their best effort. It was their minimum effort. The force they deployed represented a fraction of their available capability. The remainder of their fleet, which outnumbered the deployed force by a significant margin, powered down and entered standby once the engagement concluded. They brought overwhelming force and used only what was necessary. A voice called out from the gallery. I recognized it as Fleet Admiral Soren Dre, the most aggressive of the Concordat's military commanders, and the one most likely to advocate for continued confrontation. Are we supposed to simply accept this, surrender without a fight, hand over our sovereignty because one battle went badly? I turned to face him, Admiral. With respect, one battle did not go badly. One battle revealed that we never had the capacity to fight in the first place. The humans spent 2 years absorbing our raids without retaliation, and during that time, they were not suffering in silence. They were studying us. They mapped our shield frequencies. They decoded our encryption protocols. They identified structural vulnerabilities in our ship designs that our own engineers have not found. And they did all of this while simultaneously debating among themselves whether or not they should respond with force at all. I activated the display I had brought with me and projected the navigational chart that Grace Holloway had shown me in my quarters. The blue markers appeared above the speaking floor, surrounding a 3-dimensional model of Concordat space. Every major system, every strategic asset, every population center, all of them wrapped in a shell of human fleet positions so thorough that it looked like a diagram of an organ inside a body. These are current human fleet deployments, I said. They are already in position around our entire territory. They moved into these positions during the Corvus Reach operation, and we did not detect a single ship until they chose to be detected. They are not blockading us. They are not intercepting our ships or disrupting our commerce. They are simply present, watching, waiting. The chamber went quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a revelation that cannot be argued with because it is written across the sky in a language everyone can read. I want to tell you something that is not in my report, I said, because it is not the kind of thing that fits in a report. It is something I saw with my own eyes and felt in my own body, and it is the reason I am standing here, recommending that we accept Earth's terms without modification. I took a breath. When the human soldiers boarded the Aethrin Voss, they secured the bridge in 3 minutes. They restrained every officer, including Commander Dreven Cal, without injuring a single person. And then their captain, a woman named Lena Whitford, walked onto the bridge and spoke to us in our own language, with an accent better than most of our regional dialects. I asked her why the humans had waited 2 years to respond, why they had endured 14 raids and 11 civilian deaths and billions in property damage without ever striking back. I looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as I could. She said, "Because we were hoping you would stop on your own. We always hope for that." Those are the words that should terrify this council. Not the fleet, not the technology, not the 400 ships that dismantled 3 fleets in 11 minutes. The terrifying thing about humanity is that they had the power to end this conflict on the first day, and they chose not to use it. They chose to write letters instead. They chose to send protests and formal complaints and requests for dialogue, not because those methods were the only tools available to them, but because those methods were the tools they wanted to work. I deactivated the display and stood in the center of the speaking floor, with nothing between me and the council but air and truth. They wanted diplomacy to succeed. They wanted us to choose peace on our own. For 2 years, against all evidence, against every provocation, against every raid and every insult and every dismissal, they hoped, and that hope was not naivety. It was a choice made by millions of people who believed that the measure of a civilization is not what it can destroy, but what it refuses to destroy. Admiral Soren Dre spoke again from the gallery. You paint a very noble picture, Senis. But noble intentions do not change the fact that they have surrounded our space with warships. What guarantees do we have that they will honor their own terms? What stops them from taking everything once we have disarmed? It was a fair question, the kind of question that sounds strong in a chamber full of military officers, but dissolves when held up against the evidence. Admiral, I said, if the humans wanted to take everything, they would have done so already. They had our entire fleet in their hands. They had our navigational databases, our military encryption, our shield frequencies, and the coordinates of every system we control. They could have jumped their 400 ships directly to the homeworld and been in orbit before we received the first distress signal. Instead, they gave us food. They treated our wounded. They returned our personnel unharmed. And they sent me back with terms so reasonable that our own trade negotiators would have been embarrassed to propose them. I let that settle. The humans do not need guarantees from us. We need to understand the guarantee they are offering. Their guarantee is this. They are choosing, right now, at this moment, not to use the power they have. Just as they chose for 2 years not to respond to our raids, just as they chose at Corvus Reach to disable rather than destroy. They are giving us the same chance they have given us from the beginning, the chance to do the right thing voluntarily. And now, I said, and I felt the weight of every word as it left my mouth. They have stopped hoping. Not because they are angry, not because they want revenge, but because we forced them past the line they drew for themselves. We took their patience, and their restraint, and their willingness to absorb harm, and we treated those things as weakness. We laughed at their letters. We escalated when they warned us to stop. We sent 96 warships to answer their final request for peace. And so they responded. Not with cruelty, not with excessive force, not with the kind of disproportionate retaliation that we ourselves would have employed if the positions were reversed. They responded with the minimum force necessary to make their point, and then they offered us fair terms and a chance to preserve our dignity. I paused for the last time. The terms are these: full withdrawal from human space, reparations equal to the exact value of what we took, calculated to the last credit. A permanent diplomatic channel. No occupation. No oversight. No demands for submission or subservience. They are asking us to pay for what we stole, and to stop stealing. That is all. And they are asking it politely. The word landed in the chamber like a stone in still water. Politely. The same word we had mocked for 2 years. The same quality we had treated as proof of inferiority. And now, standing in the wreckage of our assumptions, surrounded by the evidence of our miscalculation, that word meant something different. It meant what it had always meant. It meant that the humans were giving us a choice they did not have to give, and doing it with a grace we did not deserve. Soren Dre spoke one final time from the gallery. And if we refuse? Then they wait, I said. Their liaison told me they are very good at waiting. The fleets around our systems will remain in position, not attacking, not blockading, just present. And every day they wait is another day they demonstrate that they are capable of destroying us and choose not to. Every day is another reminder that the Dravine Concordat exists because humanity allows it to exist. That is the reality, Admiral. We can accept it with dignity now, or we can accept it with less dignity later, but we will accept it. The vote was called within the hour. It was not unanimous. Soren Dre and 3 others voted against acceptance, but the majority, led by Councillor Mayeth and supported by every member of the diplomatic corps, voted to accept Earth's terms in full. I was appointed as the first Concordat ambassador to Earth the following day. Councillor Mayeth delivered the appointment personally, in her chambers, with a cup of bitter tea and a look that was equal parts pride and sorrow. "You were right," she said, "about all of it, from the very first report." "I was not right early enough," I said. "You were right when it mattered." I traveled to Earth aboard a diplomatic vessel that made the journey in 4 days. The human escort ships that accompanied us through the transit corridor were visible for the first hour, and then vanished from our sensors entirely. They were still there, I could feel it, but they had decided we did not need to see them anymore. Earth appeared in the forward viewport as a sphere of blue and green and white that looked, from a distance, like something fragile, something that needed protection. I learned later that this appearance was the greatest deception the humans had ever accomplished, because there was nothing fragile about that world or the people who lived on it. I was met at the orbital receiving station by Grace Holloway. She was wearing civilian clothes, a simple dark jacket over a light shirt, and when she saw me, she smiled. Not the diplomatic smile I had seen on 1,000 faces across a dozen species. A real smile. The kind that reaches the eyes and changes the shape of the face, and communicates something that words cannot. "Ambassador Senis," she said, and extended her hand. I had studied the gesture. An open palm, offered freely, to be grasped and held. In the earliest days of human civilization, it was a way of showing that you carried no weapon. Over the centuries, it had evolved into something more. A promise, a greeting, a small act of trust between two individuals who were choosing to meet each other as equals. I took her hand. Her grip was warm and firm, and exactly strong enough to communicate confidence without aggression. I held it for a moment longer than protocol required, because I wanted to feel it. I wanted to remember what it felt like to touch the hand of someone who belonged to the most powerful species in the galaxy, and use that power to shake hands instead of make fists. She led me to a transit shuttle that descended through the atmosphere toward the surface. As we dropped below the cloud layer, I saw cities, vast, sprawling networks of buildings and parks and waterways that covered the continental surfaces like living circuits. And between the cities, green, forests and grasslands and agricultural zones that stretched to every horizon. The city where we landed was called Lagos. It was louder and more colorful than anything I had expected. The streets were full of people, not soldiers, not officials. People, walking, talking, laughing, arguing, carrying children, walking animals, eating food from vendor stalls, playing music on corners. The noise was extraordinary. A wall of human sound that hit me like a physical force the moment I stepped outside the transit station. No one looked at me with fear. A few glanced at me with curiosity, the way you might look at an unfamiliar bird that has landed in your garden, but no one stopped. No one stared. No one pointed or whispered or backed away. I was an alien standing in the middle of a human city, a representative of a civilization that had been raiding their colonies for 2 years, and they treated me like a visitor. An interesting visitor, perhaps, but just a visitor. Grace Holloway walked beside me through the streets and pointed out landmarks with the casual enthusiasm of someone showing a friend around their neighborhood. A market here, a university there. A park, where children were playing a game that involved kicking a ball back and forth, with extraordinary energy and no apparent rules. "This is what you were protecting," I said. She looked at me. "This is what we are always protecting." I understood then, not with my mind, which had understood since Corvus Reach, but with something deeper. The humans had not fought to prove their strength. They had not demonstrated their power to humiliate us or establish dominance. They had done what they did because this, all of this, the cities and the children and the laughter and the vendor stalls, was what existed on the other side of their restraint. This was what they went home to when the fighting stopped. This was the life they were unwilling to surrender and unable to ignore. They were not warriors who happened to be civilized. They were a civilization that happened to be capable of war. And when the war was over, when the threat was neutralized and the terms were accepted and the fleets powered down, they went back to their lives. They went back to kicking balls in parks and arguing in markets and carrying children through noisy streets. Because the war was never the point. The war was the interruption. This was the point. This had always been the point. That evening, in the quarters they had prepared for me in the diplomatic residence, I sat at a desk that overlooked the city and opened the journal I had been given for official records. The sounds of Lagos drifted through the window, a symphony of 8 billion people living their lives without any apparent awareness that they were the most dangerous civilization in the known galaxy. I wrote the first entry. To any species reading this record in the centuries to come, I offer one piece of counsel, earned at great cost and delivered without reservation. If the humans send you a polite letter, answer it. Answer it immediately. Answer it with respect and sincerity and genuine willingness to engage, because the letter is not the warning. The letter is the mercy. The warning is what comes when the letters stop. And if you are fortunate enough to receive that warning before it is too late, understand what it means. It means that a civilization of 8 billion souls spent every available moment trying not to fight you. It means that committees voted and citizens petitioned and officers argued for patience, over and over, because they believed you were worth the effort. It means that every day of silence was a day someone on Earth chose hope over action. Do not waste that hope. Do not mock that patience. Do not mistake that mercy for weakness. Because when the humans stop being polite, they do not become cruel. They become precise. And precision, delivered by a species that would rather shake your hand than raise its fist, is the most terrifying force in the universe. I set down the pen and looked out at the city. Somewhere in the distance, music was playing. Somewhere closer, someone was laughing. The most powerful species in the galaxy was going about its evening, and not one of them was thinking about the Dravine Concordat. They had already moved on. And that, more than anything else, told me everything I needed to know about humanity.